Profession by Isaac Asimov, the middle of page 33 to page 38, at the gap at the top of the page. There was a line waiting to enter the hall. Apparently, Metallurgy Olympics was to be an exciting and closely fought one. At least the illuminated sky sign above the hall said so, and the jostling crowd seemed to think so. It would have been a rainy day, George thought, from the color of the sky, but San Francisco had drawn the shield across the breadth from the bay to the ocean. It was an expense to do so, but of course all expenses were warranted when the comfort of the outworlders was concerned. They would be in town for the Olympics. They were heavy spenders, and for each recruit taken, there would be a fee both to Earth and to the local government from the planet sponsoring the Olympics. It paid to keep the outworlders in mind of a particular city as a pleasant place in which to spend the Olympics' time. San Francisco knew what it was doing. George, lost in thought, was suddenly aware of a gentle pressure on his shoulder blade and a voice saying, "Are you in line here, young man?" The line moved up without George's having noticed the widening gap. He stepped forward hastily and muttered, "Sorry, sir." There was a touch of two fingers on the elbow of his jacket, and he looked about furtively. The man behind him nodded cheerfully. He had iron gray hair, and under his jacket he wore an old-fashioned sweater that buttoned down the front. He said, "I didn't mean to sound sarcastic." "No offense." "All right, then." He sounded cozily talkative. "I wasn't sure you might not simply be standing there and entangled with the line, so to speak, only by accident. I thought you might be a what?" George said sharply. "Why, a contestant, of course. You look young." George turned away. He felt neither cozy nor talkative, and bitterly impatient with busybodies. A thought struck him. Had an alarm been set out for him? Was his description known, or his picture? Was gray hair behind him trying to get a good look at his face? He hadn't seen any news reports. He craned his neck to see the moving strip of news headlines parading across the one section of the sky shield, somewhat lackluster against the gray of the cloudy afternoon sky. It was no use. He gave up at once. The headlines would never concern themselves with him. This was Olympics time, and the only news worth headlining was the competitive scores of the winners and the trophies won by continents, nations, and cities. It would go on like that for weeks, with scores calculated on a per capita basis, and every city finding some way of calculating itself into a position of honor. His own town had once placed third in the Olympics, covering wiring technician, third in the whole state. There was still a plaque saying so in the town hall. George hunched his head between his shoulders and shoved his hands into his pocket and decided that made him more noticeable. He relaxed and tried to look unconcerned and felt no safer. He was in the lobby now, and no authoritative hand had yet been laid on his shoulder. He filed into the hall itself and moved as far forward as he could. It was with an unpleasant shock that he noticed gray hair next to him. He looked away quickly and tried reasoning with himself. The man had been right behind him in line after all. Gray hair, beyond a brief tentative smile, paid no attention to him, and besides, the Olympics was about to start. George rose in his seat to see if he could still make out the position assigned to Trevelyan, and at that moment, that was all his concern. Now we're on page 35 at the gap at the top. The hall was moderate in size and shaped in the classical long oval, with the spectators in the two balconies running completely about the rim, and the contestants in the linear trough down the center. The machines were set up. The progress boards above each bench were dark, except for the name and contestant of each man. The contestants themselves were on the scene reading, talking together. One was checking his fingernails minutely. It was, of course, considered bad form for any contestant to pay any attention to the problem before him until the instant of the starting signal. George studied the program sheet that he found in the appropriate slot on the arm of his chair, and he found Trevelyan's name. His number was 12. And, to George's chagrin, that was the wrong end of the hall. He could make out the figure of contestant 12 standing with his hands in his pockets, back to his machine, and staring at the audience as though he were counting the house. George couldn't make out the face. Still, that was Trev. George sank back in his seat. He wondered if Trev would do well. He hoped, as a matter of conscious duty, that he would, and yet there was something within him that felt rebelliously resentful. George, professionless, here watching. Trevelyan, registered metallurgist, non-ferrous, there competing. George wondered if Trevelyan had competed in his first year. George wondered if Trevelyan had competed in his first year. Sometimes men did if they felt particularly confident or hurried. It involved a certain risk. However efficient the educative process, a preliminary year on Earth, oiling the stiff knowledge, as the expression went, ensured a higher score. If Trevelyan was repeating, maybe he wasn't doing so well. George felt ashamed that the thought pleased him just a bit. He looked about. The stands were almost full. This would be a well-attended Olympics, which meant greater strain on the contestants, or greater drive, perhaps, depending on the individual. Why Olympics, he thought suddenly. He had never known. Why was bread called bread? Once he had asked his father, "Why do they call it Olympics, Dad?" And his father had said, "Olympics means competition." George had said, Is when Stubby and I fight an Olympics, Dad?" Clayton Sr. had said, "No, Olympics is a kind of competition, and don't ask silly questions. You'll know all you have to know when you get educated." George, back in the present, sighed and crowded down into his seat. All you have to know. Funny that the memory should be so clear now. When you get educated. No one ever said, if you get educated. He always had asked silly questions, it seemed to him now. It was as though his mind had some instinctive foreknowledge of its inability to be educated and had gone about asking questions in order to pick up scraps here and there as best it could. And at the house, they encouraged him to do so because they agreed with his mind's instinct. It was the only way. He sat up suddenly. What the devil was he doing? Falling for that lie? Was it because Trev was there before him, an eduquee, competing in the Olympics, that he himself was surrendering? He wasn't feeble-minded. No! And the shout of denial in his mind was echoed by the sudden clamor in the audience as everyone got to his feet. The box seat in the very center of the long side of the oval was filled with an entourage wearing the colors of Novia, and the word Novia went up above them on the main board. This is the gap at the bottom of page 36. Novia was a grade A world with a large population and a thoroughly developed civilization, perhaps the best in the galaxy. It was the kind of world that every Earthman wanted to live in someday, or, failing that, to see his children live in. George remembered Trevelyan's insistence on Novia as a goal, and there he was, competing for it. Top of 37. The lights went out on the section of the ceiling above the audience, and so did the wall lights. The central trough in the center, where the contestants waited, became floodlit. Again, George tried to make out Trevelyan. Too far. The clear, polished voice of the announcer sounded. "Distinguished Novian sponsors, ladies, gentlemen, the Olympics competition for metallurgist, non-ferrous, is about to begin. Our contestants are..." Carefully and conscientiously, he read off the list in the program. Names, hometowns, educative years. Each received its cheers. The San Franciscans among them receiving the loudest. When Trevelyan's name was reached, George surprised himself by shouting and waving madly. The gray-haired man next to him surprised him even more by cheering likewise. George could not help but stare in astonishment, and his neighbor leaned over to say, speaking loudly in order to be heard over the hubbub, No one here from my hometown. I'll root for yours. Someone you know? George shrank back. No. I noticed you looking in that direction. Would you like to borrow my glasses? No, thank you. Why didn't the fool mind his own business? The announcer went on with the other formal details concerning the serial number of the competition, the method of timing, and the scoring, and so on. Finally, he approached the meat of the matter, and the audience grew silent as it listened. Each contestant will be supplied with a bar of non-ferrous alloy of unspecified composition. He will be required to sample and assay the bar, reporting all results correctly to 4 decimals in percent. All will utilize this purpose in a Beeman microspectrograph model FX-2, each of which is at the moment not in working order. There was an appreciative shout-out from the audience. Each contestant will be required to analyze the fault of his machine and correct it. Tools and spare parts are supplied. The spare part necessary may not be present, in which case it must be asked for, and time of delivery thereof will be deducted from final time. Are contestants ready? The board above contestant 5 flashed a frantic red signal. Contestant 5 ran off the floor and returned a moment later. The audience laughed good-naturedly. Are the contestants ready? The board remained blank. Any questions? Still blank. You may begin. This concludes the reading to the gap on page 38.